if you work these stressful jobs, you basically adapt to this stimulus that is stress and become better at managing it.
We don't want you to not have a physiological response when you encounter a stressor. We want you to have that physiological response. For your safety, it actually can improve performance, all sorts of different things. But what we don't want is for you to have that prolonged physiological response for a sustained period of time, because then what we get is what many folks refer to as blunted affect, or in the stress physiology literature, what we call habituation.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Good People, episode 46. Today, I was joined by Dr. Joseph Schwartz. He is an associate professor at Florida State University in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Most of his research focuses on the interplay between biological and environmental factors and their influence on behavioral outcomes and health outcomes. In today's episode, we talked about stress. We talked about the physiological and biological responses that happen in our bodies when we experience stressful events, how dealing with adversity as a child affects your ability to deal with stress later in life, and some interventions to help you deal with stressors. Step back in time with the Rockingham Vintage Baseball Club. A new adult recreational league is forming in Rockingham County, Virginia. Transport yourself to 1864 as we revive the spirit of the early days of baseball. No baseball experience is required, just a love for the game or a willingness to try something new. Join them for their first practice on Saturday, March 16th at 11 a.m. behind the Elkton Community Center. You can also find them on Facebook at Rockingham Vintage Baseball Club for more information and get ready to step up to the plate. I will also attach the link to the Facebook group in the description below. Before we begin today's episode, if you guys are watching today's episode on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on our notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. Any interaction that you have with our show really does help us grow this thing, and we appreciate it and you. Enjoy the show. All right, Joe, well, welcome to the show, man. I really appreciate you sitting down and joining me today.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate your interest in our paper, and I'm excited to get to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing in this area.
Yeah. Before we jump into our conversation, the topic of today's episode, our previous correspondences, you mentioned that you just started CrossFit relatively recently, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Back in September of 2023. So this will be my first open. I saw the workout posted recently, and I didn't do it today. So my box programs it for Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I'm looking forward to it, and I've really enjoyed CrossFit so far. It's been a really great experience.
Yeah, right on. I was just going to say, it's kind of funny that we're doing it on the first day of the Open.
Exactly.
I actually did the workout this morning, and I was curious if you were going to participate.
I am. I'm registered. I got a shirt. I'm all in. I'm ready to go. I don't know how good my scores are going to be, but I'm all in. I'm going to post my scores as soon as I'm able to do the workout, and I'm looking forward to it. Not necessarily to like the 90 burpees that we're going to do for this first WOD, but
it did get pretty brutal, but good luck with that. I just wanted to mention that on here to make sure we showed that we are supporters of the CrossFit Open.
Definitely. Absolutely. 100%.
Well, get me started with a brief overview of your position, the kind of research that you engage in, the work that you do.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm currently an associate professor in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State University. And I'm a social scientist by training. So I'm a criminologist, meaning I'm interested in, why people engage in criminal behavior, and then also the implications of criminal justice contact and in being involved in the criminal justice system as well. And I'm a little bit unique in the sense that I do focus on both biological and social factors that contribute to those different factors, as well as implications that are both biological and environmental from being justice involved or being having a family member that's justice involved, for example. And so I'm a little bit unique in that way, and I work within what I would refer to as the biosocial perspective. And what that means is just basically that I'm interested in both biology and environment when it comes to shaping these things. And really, I think, my research agenda and what I'm interested in at the broadest level, and I can talk more specifically about some of the more specific projects I've worked on, is really how when we have these environmental experiences and the long arduous process as to how they ultimately culminate or develop into different behavioral patterns, what are all of those intermediate processes? Because it's a really complex set of processes. There's biological systems that are activated, physiological, neurological systems that are activated, but also lots of different social factors, right? I mean, how we behave in the environments that we find ourselves in and how we respond to those environments is dynamic. And those environments change as a result, our behaviors change as a result, and we have this sort of back and forth feedback loop that occurs. And so to me, that's really what I'm interested in with the research that I do. And that really brought me to this road of looking at specifically stress, the implications of stress, stress responsivity, and so forth.
I'm curious why that is uncommon, because to me, just from an outside perspective, it seems sort of, I hesitate to use the word elementary, but like, of course, your biology and your environment both impact who you are, the type of behavior that you engage in, et cetera. Why is that such a rare thing?
I think there's a couple of reasons. And for one, I'll preface by saying I think it's becoming less rare. And I'm seeing a lot more students who are interested in this. I teach an undergraduate course here at FSU that we call human behavior, but it's essentially a biosocial criminology course where we go over kind of the basic fundamentals of how these things happen. And it's a very popular course. Every time I teach it, I have students who work in either psychology or in other disciplines, and they're interested in crime and antisocial behavior. And they're like, this is what I've been looking for, right? This is exactly where my interests intersect, is right here. But historically, I think it's been, at least in criminology and sociology, which are the fields that I sort of come from as far as my training goes, it's been a bit less popular because there's a lot of stigma around introducing this idea of biology and crime. And in some ways for good reason. In some ways because the science has really been misused and bastardized and used in a way to potentially do harm to other groups, specific groups. And so I understand the apprehension. The problem is that a lot of that work is over 100 years old. And biology's come a long way, physiology's come a long way. We have a much better understanding of how these things align with environment. We know that it's not nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture for virtually all behavioral outcomes that we could possibly be interested in, as well as other interesting outcomes like mental health outcomes and physical health outcomes, of course. I always like to point out to my students and to people who maybe are a bit skeptical, think about when you go to a doctor for the first time. They're going to give you a stack of paperwork to fill out, right? You have to write your name like 15 times on all the different forms. But one of the forms inevitably will ask you about family history. Do you have a family history of high blood pressure, for example, or diabetes, or certain forms of cancer? And the reason why they ask you those questions is because we know that, yes, smoking cigarettes, for example, would increase the probability of developing heart disease as well as lung cancer and lots of other problems. But if you have a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle who also had those issues, well, you have a biological predisposition towards that particular ailment. And so it's not to say that biological predisposition is all that matters. Even in the medical world, there's very few outcomes where a single gene or just biological predisposition will inevitably result with certainty in the development of a disorder. But in the behavioral world, it's impossible. It does not happen. Behavioral outcomes are far too complicated. So I think that's my long-winded way of maybe answering your question, but I think a lot of it really stems from really a misunderstanding of how modern biology works, and some of this apprehension that has stemmed from the way that biology has been misused to do harm to certain groups historically. And so I've really tried in my work to be really clear about, hey, this is what these findings mean, this is what these findings don't mean, and this is how they can be used, this is how they shouldn't be used, and that sort of thing. But I think that there's still a lot of folks who are kind of set in their ways, and it can be challenging to convince them that, hey, look, biology's really come a long way in the last 100 years. We've made tremendous breakthroughs in understanding how these systems work.
Okay, so just to clarify, it's the danger with that line of thinking, at least in theory, is that we never want to say because of a biological thing you are damned to a certain whatever outcome, and the thought is let's look more on the environmental / behavioral side of things, because that I guess, carries more weight. Is that correct in assuming?
100%. And ultimately, though, and you summarized it perfectly, but ultimately, though, isn't that just as concerning, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if we say that the environment is deterministic, right? That if you encounter poor environments, negative environments, which lots of folks are inevitably, tragically going to be subjected to, and it's none of their fault, right? I mean, you think about children who are growing up in inner cities or who are experiencing poverty or all sorts of different problems, social issues that they're experiencing. They have no control over that, and so we're damning them to the same types of outcomes, but stemming from a environmentally deterministic view as opposed to a biologically deterministic view. Both of which I would argue are equally flawed. Because both of those views are overly simplistic and really omit really important key factors that definitely have an impact on behavioral and health-related outcomes.
It seems like it's a bit of a semantics argument because it's like if somebody's father is an alcoholic and they're worried about becoming an alcoholic and potentially do, it's like, what's the point of arguing? Like, am I an alcoholic because biologically my dad passed this on to me, or because I saw him drinking and using this as a tool to deal with his traumas and issues, right? Like, I don't think that why matters as much as, uncovering that there is definitely a connection there in some capacity.
Yeah, I mean, as a social scientist, I would say we are interested in the why.
Okay.
I think that's one of the things that we are interested in. For a few reasons. So for one, just basic science, what we would refer to as basic science, which is just understanding phenomenon, right? Like, I want to know why something works the way it does. So if somebody does become an alcoholic, what are the key factors that contribute to that? And it's just interesting from a scientific perspective, right? Like, just knowing how the world works. But in addition, if we can understand how these different factors culminate and come together, then we can hopefully implement new policies and interventions that limit the likelihood that negative outcome will occur. And so, understanding that, yes, you do have a biological predisposition. We know that, alcoholism, substance abuse is definitely heritable. There's a biological component, absolutely, that's passed intergenerationally. But like you just said perfectly, also, demonstrating this behavior of using these substances in a problematic way, having those substances available to children, for example, at a young age, maybe even encouraging them to use those substances in a problematic way. All of those things matter, and they all matter in different ways. And so if we can understand exactly how they all come together, and it's not going to be the same for everybody, right? That's why social science is a really challenging type of research to do. There's so much variability in human beings. But if we can understand how those things come together, then hopefully we can implement some kind of intervention or develop some kind of intervention to prevent those negative outcomes from occurring, or to at least limit the likelihood that they would.
Why have you become interested in this kind of work?
So, what it really goes back to is I kind of fell into it in a few different ways. And I'd say my initial gateway drug into the biosocial perspective was when I was a criminology undergraduate student, and I just needed course hours, and I took a biological psychology course, and just because I was like, oh, that sounds good, why not? And so I took the class, and it was amazing. And the professor of the class, we talked about like neurotransmission and how the brain ultimately shapes behavior in various ways, and I was hooked. And at one point, I actually thought about changing my major to be to focus more on neuroscience specifically, and sort of abandoned that and decided to do a master's degree. But as I started my master's, I was fortunate that one of my mentors, Steve Tibbetts, when I was at California State University, San Bernardino, Steve Tibbetts really encouraged me to start reading in the biosocial area. And he was sending me papers, classic papers, modern papers, books, so on. And I started reading some of this research, and everything that I thought I knew about the formation of human behavior basically became challenged. And it wasn't an immediate like love affair either. It was like I was kind of skeptical at first. I was like, how could this be? How can we see these connections occurring? Specifically, like I remember reading this classic adoption study by Sarnoff Mednick from 1984. And in the study, what they looked at was they had a cohort of individuals who were adoptees, so children who were adopted, and they had information on their adoptive parents and information on their biological parents. And what they found is that there was a small and not a very, not a pronounced effect, but there was an association between children's likelihood to be justice involved, to ultimately be arrested or be incarcerated, and their biological parents' arrest record. And that was really interesting to me as a budding social scientist, because I was like, there's no social connection there. These kids were adopted at birth. How could this happen? But what was even more interesting about the study is that the children that had the greatest risk of ultimately being arrested or incarcerated were those who had both biological and adoptive parents who had justice involvement. And so it was this interaction between their social environment and their biological predisposition that really drove this association. And that was one of the studies that was just a turning point for me, where it started to make me really think differently about how behavior ultimately culminates and what are the key factors that contribute to behavior. And so once all of those things sort of came together, and then I started my doctoral work, I started to become a lot more interested in sensitive populations and populations that are, commonly examined within criminology and criminal justice research, but that are subjected to this term that we throw around willy-nilly called stress. And I was fortunate that the university that I was at previously, University of Nebraska, there were some folks there and an interdisciplinary research center that was really well equipped to study stress and stressors in various populations, and really started to get me down that road and thinking about how those processes ultimately work and impact behavior and health outcomes.
Right on. And excuse me, the work that I stumbled upon when I first found your work was this interplay between your childhood experiences of adversity, which later turns into your ability to handle stress later in life. And I think a good starting point for this is to sort of talk about some of the long-term or even short-term effects of some of these issues, specifically on the back end of that equation, which is whether you're high or low stress responsivity. So let's start there. And if you don't mind sort of defining some of these terms as you go, because I know, like you said, we've kind of loosely used the term stress. What exactly does that mean? But in a summation, what is the outcomes of having high or low stress responsivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love that you called it stress responsivity too. Because one of the big problems is we use this term stress all the time. I'm guilty of it as well. I'm so stressed out. I'm just really stressed right now. I have a high stress job. Like, we use that kind of terminology all the time. And I think it really muddies the waters as to what we mean. So the concept of stress has been well documented for decades now. I mean, even really a century, if we go back to like Walter Cannon and Hans Selye and some of these people that we refer to as like the godfathers of stress research. They really defined different rules, some of which we still, abide by when it comes to stress and how stress works, and some of which, modern research has really given us more information on. But basically, I think a good starting point is to differentiate between stressors and stress responses. And stressors are the things that we encounter. And I want to say things in the environment, but I'll come back to that in a minute. The things that we encounter that trigger a stress response. And so the things I always talk about, and maybe this speaks more about me than other people, but like there's two examples that I think people can relate to pretty well. The first is, you walk into your bathroom in your house, you turn on the light, and there's a giant spider on the wall, right? I live in Florida now, and so this happens, right? Florida, I call it America's Australia. Like, we just have wild stuff that happens here. But those feelings that accompany that shock, that initial response, right? Your heart starts racing, your pupils will dilate, you get that sudden urge to move, right? Whether it's to jump back, to jump forward, to run away, to kill the spider, to trap the spider and release, whatever it is that you're going to do, that feeling is stress responsivity. That, and I'll talk about that in a physiological sense in just a moment, what's exactly happening during that moment. The other example I give is if you're driving on the freeway or the interstate, and maybe you're going a little faster than you should, and all of a sudden you look in your rearview mirror and you see the highway patrol officer behind you. And you get that feeling of when your heart sinks into your stomach and you're like, oh no, oh shit, what's happening now? Like, am I going to get pulled over? And again, your heart starts racing, right? And you feel all of that surge of adrenaline. That's your physiological response to stress. And I can go down that road as well, and we can talk about that physiological response. But the other thing I want to talk about is you don't have to actually have a stressor that manifests in reality to trigger that stress response. We do this all the time with what is referred to as psychological stressors, right? This could be worrying about something that's going to happen in the future, ruminating on a previous experience, right? I mean, we talked a little bit about CrossFit, right? We might be thinking about, oh no, we have that open workout later this week, and you're sitting there, and all of a sudden you get a full blown stress response, right? Your heart starts racing.
That happened yesterday to me in the shower. I was
Right.
literally imagining myself doing the workout, and I like got butterflies in my stomach and almost
Yeah.
puked.
Yeah, yet there was no threat there, right? There's no physical manifestation of any kind of stressor, but we respond in exactly the same way. And that can be beneficial and negative in various ways. The thing that can be particularly problematic about those psychological stressors is we can't necessarily get away from them. They don't go away, right? They're with us at all times. And so those can be particularly problematic if we talk about chronic stress, which I can get to in a moment. But physiologically, what's happening is we have a very well-defined process that's occurring, and we are triggering different endocrinological, neurological, and physiological systems when we ultimately encounter those stressors, psychological or environmental. And that culmination of all of those processes is what we would call stress responsivity or a stress response. And so I won't go through, in great detail all of the different linkages, but basically we have two main systems that are activated when we experience stress. We have the autonomic nervous system and we have the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so I'll start with the ANS axis quickly, or the ANS quickly, the autonomic nervous system. There's two branches in the autonomic nervous system. We have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. Parasympathetic nervous system is really involved with just keeping us alive long term. Digestion, we call it sometimes the rest and digest system. It's more active when we're at rest. This is one of the reasons why, if you're interested in fitness and recovery, you want to track things like your heart rate variability, because heart rate variability is directly tied to activity and activity in the parasympathetic nervous system specifically. So you want to have active parasympathetic nervous system activity when you're at rest, when you're sleeping, when you're at homeostatic balance. That's good. You want that. What happens when we experience a stressor, though, is our body goes from long-term survival mode to short-term survival mode. So that parasympathetic nervous system gets dialed back. The activity gets dialed down. We call it withdrawal of the parasympathetic nervous system. And then the sympathetic nervous system comes online. And this is what, Walter Cannon coined the term of fight or flight. It's what we think of typically when we think of stress response, right? Heart racing, we see increased heart rate, pushing more oxygenated blood to those large muscle groups. We see dilation of pupils, so we can take in more visual stimuli, process that stimuli more effectively. We see the mobilization of glucose to the brain, so we can have increased brain activity. All those things that we experience, right, when we think of being stressed, which I can come back to, but really is a good thing, right? If you think about what we're trying to do, where our bodies are trying to mobilize us to encounter a stressor and overcome it, to survive, basically. So collectively, those are all very good processes and really adaptive in a general sense. So that's essentially the ANS at a broad level, and we can talk more about specific aspects if you're interested. But then for the HPA axis is more of what we call a slow neural response. And so ultimately, we have an immediate response from the ANS. The HPA axis, though, the main product of the HPA axis is a glucocorticoid, which is a specialized hormone called cortisol, which many people are probably familiar with. It's the most common stress hormone that we typically talk about. And cortisol, actually, we don't see changes in cortisol in blood and saliva until about 20 to 30 minutes after we encounter a stressor. So it takes a little bit of time for cortisol to actually be secreted into the bloodstream and be detectable. And that's by design. So we sort of have this handoff between SNS activity and HPA axis activity that allow us to, again, go through those physiological processes to encounter and overcome that stressor. But then also cortisol is directly involved with stress recovery. So getting us back to a point where we can have that SNS ramp down, that PNS ramp back up, and get back to homeostatic balance. And there's lots of other cool things that cortisol does. For example, it triggers an immunological response. It triggers inflammatory responses, which in the moment of experiencing a stressor can be extremely important. If we, for example, sustain an injury when we're a physical injury, That's going to prevent infection to some degree. It's going to begin the healing process as quickly as possible to try to overcome some of those issues. So physiologically, those are the types of things that are happening. And what's interesting, I think, is that a lot of times we kind of understand these things are happening, right? Even if we don't understand it down to the physiological level, we understand like that feeling of butterflies that you described, right? Or we understand that feeling of fear or fight or flight. Those are all things that are very well understood by humans. But it is very interesting how the body is priming itself to face adversity, right, in these instances, and hopefully overcome that adversity. So that's what we would talk about with like when you're experiencing stress, what is actually happening. We can talk about low responsivity if you want to, because that's also really interesting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just would like to point out too that the main differences here are literally biologically happening inside of you, right? Like I would imagine that on the other end of that, for low responsivity, you're experiencing all of the same systems, but they're just managing it more efficiently.
It could be. So one of the things that I run into, because I do work with first responders and law enforcement when it comes to understanding how stress impacts their job and decision making and their family lives and their longevity and well-being. I think a lot of times they fall into that trap of thinking, well, I have a stressful job, but if I wasn't so stressed at my job, then maybe my life would be better and I'd have these better health outcomes and so on. Not necessarily, because if you think about what is stress, like experiencing a stressor, stress is actually just a form of stimulation. It's a specialized form of stimulation. And so, a lot of times we think about these negative things that can happen, right? Or even if we're anticipating something that's going to be challenging. Oh man, I have this tough workout coming up tomorrow morning, or oh man, I have this, this challenging. I don't know. For me, I would think about like this, some kind of a presentation or something that I have to do in front of folks, and and you're kind of thinking about it and kind of thinking negatively about it, and you have those responses. But if we think about physiologically what happens when my daughter, performs well at a sporting event, or she, breaches some sort of academic milestone or something, the joy that I feel, the stimulation that results in physiologically is virtually indistinguishable from what I experience when I am stressed out. Or you think about interacting with maybe somebody who you're romantically attracted to, for example, right? And you have that connection, that spark that occurs. You get all those same feelings, right? You get those butterflies, you get that physiological arousal that occurs. And so if we have blunted responses physiologically, not only does it prevent us from having and triggering those stress responses, which, as I mentioned, and again, we can kind of come back to, are largely adaptive, at least in the short term. It also prevents us from having those similar types of responses when we experience other forms of stimulation. And that can be a really harsh, negative life to live, right? Where we don't have that joy that accompanies these more positive experiences that can also trigger those physiological responses.
Yeah, so presumably it's just like any other thing you can train. When you go to the gym, you squat X amount of weight and you get better at squatting X amount of weight over time. If you work these stressful jobs, you basically adapt to this stimulus that is stress and become better at managing it.
For some folks, and that's the hope. That's the hope, right? Like in the moment, we don't want you, if you're a corrections officer, police officer, paramedic, emergency room nurse, we don't want you to not have a physiological response when you encounter a stressor. We want you to have that physiological response. For your safety, it actually can improve performance, all sorts of different things. But what we don't want is for you to have that prolonged physiological response for a sustained period of time, because then what we get is what many folks refer to as blunted affect, or in the stress physiology literature, what we call habituation. And habituation can be a good thing, right? It can be kind of what you're talking about, right? You do your first really challenging workout and man, you're taxed. But then you do that same workout the 15th time, the 20th time, and yeah, maybe you're taxed, but not to the same degree, right? You don't have that same response. And so that can be a good thing if we don't want a heightened physiological response to that particular stimulus. But habituation can also be problematic depending on exactly when it's occurring and is it preventing then that adaptive stress response from occurring. That's when it can be problematic.
That's the videos of the snake charmers walking in a room of like 100 snakes and just like smacking them without any fear that, they're going to get bitten.
Exactly. So the first time we walk into that, well, for me, I always say I'm like Indiana Jones. I don't like snakes, and I live in Florida, so
Yeah.
it's not a good combination. But like the first time that person walked in the room, I guarantee you they didn't feel that way, right? They even if they don't have a problem with snakes, they probably still had a heightened physiological response. But yeah, the 20th, 100th, 500th time they do it, yeah, they're habituated. They don't feel that same response.
Okay. Give me a real world example of a high stress responsivity and then a low stress responsivity.
Okay. So in like a problematic sense or just in like a general example?
I think just general so that we have an understanding of, I think obviously the underlying principles of this are very fascinating and it's cool to understand, but from like a practicality standpoint, an individual that has high responsivity, what is a situation that they would be in? How would they react versus somebody who has this low responsivity?
Yeah, so I think for somebody with high responsivity, and what would trigger that? It would be like a novel environment, some kind of environment that we're not really that accustomed to, that we haven't really experienced much in the past, that's unique in a lot of ways. And so that's going to be that butterflies in your stomach, full blown stress response. We're gonna be a little jittery, right? We're gonna have that secretion of those catecholamines like epinephrine, which is essentially adrenaline. That's going to be that feeling, right? And we're going to respond to that. Low responsivity would be the opposite, right? You might have this novel, stressful, even traumatic experience, but you're not going to see those physiological systems activate. You won't see heart rate spike. You won't see the increased blood flow to those different muscle groups or increased mobility of glucose to the brain. So you're not going to see those physiological systems activate in the same way, even in a scenario where we would expect them to. And so I can give you a real world example, at least from research. So I was talking.
Now.
Oh yeah.
I was just going to say, I see now. I think when we were talking, I was presuming that the high responsivity, and perhaps this is true at some level, but the high responsivity was more to do with, your reaction was heightened. But it seems like that the reaction is more to do with the stimulus. So somebody with high responsivity, like you said, their stress response is more touchy to these lower stimulus things that, like some people freak out when the other day I got to the gym and I guess I didn't rinse off my coffee cup lid enough. There was still soap on it and I had like soap in my coffee. To some people that might sort of set that stress response off, something as little as that. But
Absolutely.
An individual with low responsivity, you can sort of roll with the punches a little bit more, things like that.
Absolutely. And so like the roll with the punches, I would say wouldn't necessarily be low responsivity. It just might be lower responsivity. But yeah, absolutely. And ultimately like the stress response is going to be relatively the same. So even for somebody with low responsivity, if they do encounter an environment that triggers a full-blown stress response, it will look the same as the high responsivity person. The difference being it takes more to get them there. Right. The high responsivity person, they're zero to 100, right? Like they're going to get there just from, oh my God, I hit traffic on the way to work and now I'm like totally stressed out. Whereas the lower responsivity person might be like, no big deal. It's going to take something very, very strange and very peculiar, very out of the ordinary and dangerous or traumatic to get me there. But the response physiologically, neurologically, it'll look the same for both people.
What are some of the long-term health outcomes for people that have this high responsivity?
So, I mean, it runs the gamut, man. I mean, basically, research has shown that high stress and high responsivity has been linked to virtually every negative outcome you could possibly think of. Physical health problems, long-term physical health problems like diabetes, heart disease, you name it. Mental health problems, PTSD is probably post-traumatic stress disorder is probably the most commonly examined, but lots of different mental health issues, interpersonal relationship issues, and so on. So I think, the research, there's decades and decades and decades of research linking heightened stress to these particular types of outcomes. The problem is that, again, I think it conflates stress responsivity in the short term with prolonged stress activation in the long term. And I think those are two different things, and it's problematic for us to equate them, to think of them in the same way. But I think that's what happens a lot of times with this research, is that they're viewed as being the same thing, synonymous, when in reality they're very different.
Can you explain that a little bit more? I'm trying to wrap my head around that. I'm not sure if I understand that concept. So what you're saying is that somebody with, for example, that portion of stress, which is the down regulation, I can't remember the name of the system.
The
Are you saying
PNS.
there's a difference between essentially having high stress responsivity and people who have an issue with sort of down regulating their stress?
Yeah, or recovering from stress. Exactly. Or being in an environment where those stress systems are being activated again and again and again and again and again in a relentless way. So maybe one way for me to kind of talk about this a little bit more is this concept of allostatic load. I don't know if you've heard of that before. So allostatic load is essentially based on the concept of allostasis. Allostasis is a deliberate opposite to homeostasis. So homeostasis is, again, kind of that PNS system, right? Like how we feel at rest. It's where our body is balanced and we're just kind of optimal long-term survival mode. When we encounter a stressor or something that's problematic, we move away from that homeostatic balance, right? We start activating all these systems subconsciously. And so Bruce McEwen and Teresa Seaman, they came up with this idea of allostasis, which is that activation of those different systems. So it's the opposite of homeostasis. Well, what they argued is, in the short term, that's not necessarily problematic. In fact, it's adaptive. But what happens is when those systems stay active for too long, or they get triggered over and over and over and over and over again and again and again in a really short period of time, you can begin to increase wear and tear on those systems. And collectively, that's what they refer to as allostatic load. And so the higher your overall level of allostatic load, the more wear and tear you have on those systems. Well, what happens as a result of that? It increases the probability that you'll experience these negative outcomes, physical health problems, mental health problems, and so on, because you're activating those systems more and more and more. It's like if you were driving a car and you deliberately put it in first gear and just floored it, right? You're going to move, you're going to be okay, but you're going to put a lot more strain on your engine in order to move that same mass. Compared to, using, I can't drive a manual transmission. My wife always gives me a hard time about it because she can. But if you use your transmission correctly, you'd have less wear and tear on the engine.
Yeah, I see now. So there's essentially two things that we're looking at, and maybe even more. But there's not just how I'm responding to stress or how big of a stress sets off my response, but it is also the environment is obviously extremely important, because if I'm in a place where I'm constantly being bombarded with these stressful events that set me off or trigger me in a certain way, that is also going to lead to similar negative health outcomes in the long term.
Absolutely. Exactly right.
Okay. I'm curious, based off of the recent work that I found you from, this childhood adversity aspect comes into it. I studied in undergrad communications, and we talked a lot about attachment theory, and there was this very clear distinction within that kind of work that the things that you go through when you're young and how you're taught to respond have a ton of impact on the type of person you become, your ability to handle stress, the way you communicate, all of these things. And it sounds like a lot of the work that you do too is centered around that as well. So how does childhood adversity affect our ability to respond to stress later on in life?
It's a great question, And ultimately, I would argue it plays an extremely important role for a few reasons. One, because how the environments that we encounter during childhood prime us neurologically, physiologically, for the environments that we're going to experience later in the life course. So in adolescence and adulthood. And so it's giving us kind of like a script, if you want to think about it that way, or a knowledge base about how the world works. And if we do X, what would we expect for Y to be as a result? There's lots of really interesting research on this. There's a really great theoretical perspective that I like called the lifespan wisdom model. And the idea is that, youth and children that ultimately engage in more positive risk taking. So risk taking where they're not going out and doing dangerous things where, they're playing on the edge of a cliff or something, but they're gonna do things. They're gonna step out of their comfort zone, right? They're gonna travel abroad. They're going to, maybe make friends with a peer group that's very different from the peer group they currently have. They're doing sorts of risk taking that give them information about the world, that those children tend to fare better overall. By most metrics that we can measure long term. They stay in school longer, they have higher earnings as adults, etc. Largely because they know more about the world around them and they have a better expectation of what to expect when they get out on their own and they navigate that world. And they know what risks are worth taking and what risks are maybe not worth taking. So when it comes to priming the stress responsivity system, it's very similar. What we experience in childhood tells us a lot about the environment, right? If we grow up in, a really impoverished neighborhood that is maybe ridden with violence, it's very uncommon to see that people are moving in and out of that neighborhood very regularly. A lot of times maybe adults are moving in and out because they're being incarcerated for sustained periods of time. People are dying, right, as a result of gun violence, for example. There's, food insecurity, housing insecurity. That's going to tell our physiological systems, our stress responsivity system, a lot about, okay, this is a dangerous environment and I need to be ready to go. I need to be ready to respond to this type of environment because things can go down at a moment's notice, right? But then alternatively, if you're grow up in the suburbs and everything's safe and you've never experienced any adversity whatsoever in your life at all, well, now you're sort of primed to thrive in that type of an environment, right? And that's sort of how your system is primed. So now you might have a more heightened physiological response to a negative experience because you've never had a negative experience before. The worst thing that ever happened to you was that, your parents told you that you can't use your phone or something. I mean,
your Mercedes got keyed in the parking lot.
Exactly. And so you don't know how to overcome that adversity and traverse that adversity. And so that is very, very important. And I mean, that aligns with the findings of the study that you're referencing as well, which we can go into if you're interested.
Yeah. And it seems like the two ends of the spectrum here are like one child grows up with abuse, neglect, physical, mental, high hostility environment, gun violence around, all the gamut of it. They're dealing with everything. And then that very sheltered environment too. And to draw on our two uses from earlier, it almost seems like the people that deal with all the crazy shit, their response is going to be, it's going to take a lot more to get them into this state of stress, but they sort of have this prolonged, long time spent in that state of stress. And then on the other end of that, potentially the people who don't deal with lots of adversity, they don't have a lot of time in these stressful situations. However, it's a lot easier it doesn't take something very novel to set them off or make them stressed out.
100%, exactly right. And largely, because those are the types of environments that their systems are primed towards. And then second, because people who experience adversity have to cope with it, right? They come up with coping strategies, sometimes not the most healthy or best coping strategies, but they do come up with coping strategies that allow them to overcome that adversity. Whereas if you don't experience that adversity, then you don't develop those coping strategies. Alternatively, like you said, exactly right. If we do come from environments where we're just bombarded with danger and violence, and stress constantly, well, then yeah, we're gonna have a totally maladaptive response to those environments, and that's going to be just as bad. So yeah, those would be like the two ends of the continuum. Exactly.
What is the middle ground? Is there like a perfect amount of stress that you should receive at some point in your life? I don't know. Are you familiar with Dr. Tracy Valencourt?
I don't think so. Not that I can. Not. It doesn't. Her name doesn't sound familiar, at least.
Okay, she's a research chair somewhere in Canada, I think Ontario. But I had her on the show early on, and she talked to me about bullying. And she, a lot of her work is centered around this idea that bullies aren't great. Getting bullied isn't great. And something that she really drove home was like this thing that we're about to talk about, which is that if I came up with the perfect human being and I wanted them to be resilient and able to handle stress, in my brain, I would give them some kind of adversity, likely something they chose. And I've run a lot of ultra marathons, and that's like a chosen adversity that I can handle, right? And I would give that to that person. But she was sort of making the argument that why would we ever, want people to be bullied? And I'm by no means advocating for that, but I'm curious as to what your perspective is on this, because is there a perfect amount of adversity? If so, what type? Maybe speak on that pretty broadly.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And, I'll try my best to balance my answer as an academic, but also as a dad. So it's so hard, right? Like anyone who's a parent knows, like you don't want anything negative to happen to your kids. You just don't. It breaks your heart. Like you'll take a bullet for them, right? You do anything so that they don't experience discomfort or pain. But at the same time, that's not reality, right? The world is unfortunately a place where we are going to experience adversity. So I would say, in my opinion, now I'm not a therapist and I'm not claiming to be one. My daughter reminds me all the time. She's like, Daddy, you're not a real doctor, right? I'm like, no, I'm not a real doctor. Exactly right. But what I would say is I don't think that no adversity is good. And I don't think that a problematic amount of adversity is good. Now, those aren't quantitative values that we can actually balance, right? So somewhere in between is probably going to be the sweet spot. But is that bullying? What does that look like? That's very hard to say. And the best example I can give you, I think, is as I started getting more and more into working with first responders and looking at how stress negatively impacts their well-being, I started to kind of dive more into interventions as well, potential interventions. So how do we deal with this? And I came across a really interesting intervention referred to as stress inoculation. And I don't know if you've heard of this before. But the idea is to systematically expose people to stressful environments that they would ultimately be more likely to encounter. So if we're talking about like a police officer or a paramedic or something, forcing them to go through, and it would all be, staged basically. And a lot of times these things are done either with like a written vignette, like a written description, or an audio version, but very graphic. So, encountering a crime scene where unfortunately somebody was murdered, or where a child has been abused, or these horrific things, right, that trigger, and as they should, trigger full-blown stress responses, but getting them exposed to it in a systematic way, not just to expose them to that particular stressor, which is one aspect of it, but also throughout this process of exposing them, giving them cues, giving them directives as to how to cope in real time, how to use training and use the resources that they have at their disposal to still perform their job when they are exposed to those types of things. So I don't think we can do that with kids necessarily, nor am I advocating for it. But I think that's an example of something where, yeah, adversity and stress is going to be inherent to certain aspects, well, probably all aspects of life to some degree, right? But trying to expose people to it in a safe, controlled way, and understanding there is a line, right, that we can cross ultimately, I think is really important. And so for kids, I would say the same kind of thing, right? I mean, parents have to use their best judgment, but at the same time, I think it's totally unrealistic to think, well, I'm going to prevent every negative thing from ever happening to my kid ever. Sometimes it's good to let them work it out with other kids. Hey, I've told my daughter before, she's 6 and she'll come home and she'll say, oh, so-and-so was mean to me. I'm like, well, what do you mean they were mean to me? Well, they told me they didn't want to play with me. Well, sweetie, we're going to have to just deal with that. I mean, we're going to have to find a way to just make that work. Okay. I mean, and that's a really mundane example, right? I mean, it gets really challenging with something like bullying, right? Like, where do you draw the line? I don't know, unfortunately. I wish that I did. I wish that I had a number to give you or something. But I just think, we do need some. We need some adversity to be able to navigate the world as adults in a successful way.
Yeah, well, I think it's inevitable, right? Like whether it is bullying or some other environmental thing, eventually this is kind of a beautiful thing, right? Based off of what you experience as a young person, at some level, you will eventually run into something that you have not yet handled before, whether it's when you're young or when you're old. I'll say that you went on record and said, don't pay your child's parents to tell their kids to bully your child.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, I'm absolutely saying do not do that. Yeah, 100%.
But it sounds like, and this is something that I learned from this attachment theory model that we were talking about earlier, is that obviously in extreme cases, the horrible things that happen to you will lead to negative results. But what's more important is the system that you have to handle that. And it sounds like this is sort of the same thing, that whether you're bullied in extreme cases, or somebody picks on you and physically harms you at school, like bad stuff, right? As long as your child comes home to a supportive environment and you try your best to teach them how to handle that, and say, like, sometimes this is how the world is and we just have to deal with it. That seems like you're almost training that responsivity.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, I think ultimately you're also normalizing that sort of thing, right? Which does a few things. One, it shows them, hey, this is something you're going to encounter for the rest of your life, right? I mean, I love the job I have. I'm sure you love your job too, but we all work with difficult people, and we have to navigate the world with other people that we don't necessarily get along with at all times, right? And that's just the way the world works. But also, you're kind of showing them, look, this isn't the end of the world. This isn't something to totally melt down over and just like not be able to overcome. I mean, this is just a normal thing. And I think ultimately collectively that's giving them, whether they know it or not, the ability to cope with it, but then also contextualizing it effectively, right? Like in the rank order of things that are horrible to me, like this is going somewhere towards the bottom, not somewhere towards the top. And I think that's critically important, for development and just to have a resilient, successful human being ultimately in the long run, and being able to overcome those types of stressors that are relatively mundane and common.
That's actually one of the main reasons why I'm interested in this topic so much, is because that's something that I've realized. I haven't really been an adult for that long. I'm 23, but I don't know. I was just beginning to see that this idea that I feel like when I was growing up and I would see adults, I would just not only assume that they have it figured out, but I'm like, it'll be better when I get there. And that's not true. In a lot of ways, it gets worse. And
Yeah.
there's this horrible truth that I've come to, which is that sometimes life just blows. And, to use that point of the open workout for CrossFit, and I was literally physically reacting in the shower. I was like, if this thing, just thinking about this is stressing me out. Like, I can't imagine. I have to do a lot of work to get to where, if something for real happens to me in my life, or people in my life that is upsetting, like, hopefully I'll be able to handle that. And I think there's more people in this world now than ever that struggle with dealing with adversity and stress. And I think that's why this is an important conversation to have.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you, and the data back up that observation as well. And I think part of it is a lot of the stressors that people note now as being the main sources of stress in their lives aren't manifested environmental stressors. They're psychological stressors. And so, the American Psychological Association does a Stress in America survey. I think they do it annually, but I know the last time I looked, some of the main things that people noted as being problematic, as far as like how much they ruminate on them, how much they think about them as stressors, are big things like global warming and inequality, and these things that are definitely, I mean, real, right? I mean, these are problematic aspects of the world for sure, and things that we need to be thinking about and we need to be working on. But at the same time, I mean, these are day-to-day stressors that people are experiencing, and they're psychological, so they can't get away from them. And I think that can be really problematic, because and again, I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on these things, but what I'm saying is when these are the things that are stressing us out the most as Americans, that can be somewhat problematic for sure.
Yeah, and something that I say a lot in regards to that is my perspective on living a meaningful life is very opposite of being individualistic, but truly, to help other people, you have to be all right. And in managing your stress allows you to solve problems. And so if you just are riddled with anxiety and guilt about the state of the politics in our country, or that the earth is warming up, or the criminal justice, or the criminal injustices that we're seeing, there's no way you're going to be able to help. And so you need to learn how to process that before you can take any more steps forward.
Definitely. Definitely, yeah. I mean, because ultimately, I mean, if we're stressed out and we're at this maximum level of stress responsivity and anxiety and so on, yeah, I mean, we're not going to be effective in whatever we're trying to do, right? We're not going to be a good partner or a good researcher or a good, person at our job, whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. We're not going to be a good advocate. We're not going to be good at anything. So yeah, I completely agree with that, 100%.
What is the adaptive calibration model? That's something that I read in your research, and I'm very fascinated with it. I've never heard of it before.
Yeah, so we've actually been talking about the adaptive calibration model here when we're talking about this life course kind of experiences early in childhood and how they transition into how we respond to stressors later. But adaptive calibration is really interesting, and some of my colleagues who I've worked with now for a few years, Doug Granger, who was at UC Irvine, and Jessica Calvi, who's at University of Nebraska, they both kind of brought me into this world of the adaptive calibration model. So adaptive calibration, I won't say it runs counter to what we talked about before with allostatic load, but I think it adds more context. So the idea with adaptive calibration model is that when we experience stressors, we have a stress response, right? And ultimately, what adaptive or what allostatic load would argue is, well, you have those prolonged stress exposures, and that can be bad in the long run. What adaptive calibration model says is it's not good or bad; it's adaptive, right? And so ultimately, what that means is whatever stressors you're experiencing and the trajectory of how you experience those stressors aligns with the environments that you encounter. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to result in all positive outcomes, right? Because like we said, when you have those prolonged stressor exposures, you are definitely opening up yourself to lots of different negative outcomes. But ultimately, what it's saying is as we go through life and we experience different types of environments, our physiological systems will align to those environments to help us survive and navigate those environments moving forward. So what we experience in childhood is a really good first chapter, so to speak, in our lives of, okay, what can I expect subsequently in the environment and how do I need to respond to it? And so that's really what it's based around. And so the idea is that there's 4 different developmental patterns that we can ultimately see depending on the types of environments we encounter in childhood and how we respond to stressful environments in the future as adults.
What are those 4 patterns? And I like these models a lot because attachment theory is the same. There's 4, you have 4 attachment styles. And I think it's just a good framework for anybody listening and me to sort of sum up in general what your responsivity could look like. So what are those 4 patterns?
Yeah, for sure. So the first would be what we call a sensitive model. And essentially what that means is it's kind of what we were talking about. If you're kind of sheltered, you have a really nurturing and supportive family life. You really haven't experienced much adversity at all. This isn't necessarily within the context of adaptive calibration 100% bad, because again, it's just priming us for the environments that we're more likely to encounter. So these types of folks, the sensitive kids, so to speak, are kind of what my co-author Jessica Calvi would call an orchid. Orchid or an orchid child, if you're familiar with like orchids and dandelion kind of dichotomy. Orchids are beautiful, right? They're these beautiful flowers, but they can only grow and thrive in very specific conditions. And that's similar to the sensitive model. So these are kids who, they can achieve at a very high level, but they have to be in that nurturing environment perpetually to be able to do so. If they do face adversity, it's going to be difficult for them to overcome that adversity and face it effectively.
They better hope they don't get any soap in their coffee.
Exactly. They're going to be the ones who melt down over the soap in their coffee. Exactly. And they're like, how many burpees do I have to do? So yeah. And so the second one would be buffered. And this would be kind of more that middle ground that we were talking about a little bit. So this is where they do experience some adversity in childhood, not necessarily severe abuse or neglect, but some adversity, right? Maybe they grow up in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood. Maybe they go through a period where their parent lost their job and they are food insecure or housing insecure for a short period of time. They do experience, some adversity. Their family environments are relatively neutral. Maybe mom and dad both work, and so they're not home a lot. But they're not abusive or anything, over the top. And so for these folks, they're experiencing moderate levels of stress during childhood. And they're going to have moderately well-informed stress response systems. And so when they encounter stressors later in life, they're going to be able to navigate those stressors more effectively, largely because they have coping mechanisms in place. They've lived this life. They know how to overcome that. It's not a big deal, right? They understand the hierarchy of stressors, so to speak. And then the third would be vigilance, and this is where we start to get into the other end of the problematic end of the spectrum. These are people that have experienced lots of high adversity. They have really unpredictable home environments. Maybe they moved around a lot because they were getting kicked out. They had high housing insecurity, high food insecurity, that kind of thing. They're going to have more sensitive stress response systems because they've lived in those really unpredictable environments. They have to be ready to go at all times for whatever they encounter, and they have to be able to encounter those stressors and overcome them. So that would be one aspect of that other end of problematic. And then the final one would be unemotional. And these are people that are just at the highest level of stressor exposure in childhood. These are kids that were abused severely, neglected severely. They experienced horrible traumatic experiences. And for them, they've had chronic, prolonged stressor exposure, even as they enter into adolescence and adulthood. And they have really that blunted affect we talked about, that blunted response to the environment as a result, because their stress response system has just been on overload for so long that it's just tapped out, basically. Which again is not a good thing, right? Like, to not have that response is also negative.
How much pliability is there between your ability to move between these four? Is it sort of set in stone based off of the experiences that you have through early development?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of research on that. And I think it depends on which kind of trajectory you follow. I would imagine, I'd speculate, so this is all just hypothesis here, but I think it'd be a lot harder to move, for example, from unemotional to buffered or something along those lines than it would be to move from, say, sensitive to buffered. So I think it really depends on when you experience those particular stressful experiences and how severe they are. Because again, if it's really severe, really traumatic and prolonged for even a relatively short period of time, that's going to be harder to overcome than if you have, a period where you go from being in the sensitive trajectory and you transition to the buffer trajectory, so to speak.
And I know you said there's not really any good or bad here. It's like this is what it is. It's an outcome essentially. But is it wrong for me to assume that it's likely to be, it's safer maybe to be within the buffered and vigilant than it would be the other two, the sensitive and unemotional?
Yes, from a health and behavioral and longevity and well-being perspective, 100%. I think so. I think that's where we want kids to be, right? For sure. What I mean when I say it's not good or bad is if you're in that unemotional category or the vigilant category, that aligns with your environment. And so the goal there, I think, from a healthy society would be, well, let's not let kids get into those trajectories. Let's not have where they need to have a stress response system that aligns with those types of environments, because we don't want them in those types of environments. But at the same time, if they are encountering those environments, that pattern is going to be more adaptive than what we see, with a different trajectory, given the circumstances that they're experiencing.
I think this is cool because it sort of addresses the question of I think a lot of people have a hard time with this idea that, when you're going through something, it's very hard to take a step back and process what you're going through. And I think it's really important to, in some capacity, whether it's exercise or having a habit that allows you to create that space to think about what you're going through and what you're dealing with, et cetera, because it poses the question of, when you are able to sort of look from this third point of view, is it me or is it the environment? And obviously, we've been talking about this the whole time. It's both at some level, but it gives you, what's the lowest hanging fruit? And if you can recognize that, then you can change it, or you can improve it to some capacity. Do you do any work on preventative things? Things that people can do to sort of analyze what they're going through and potentially build some of these skills of resiliency?
So I'm just starting to get into it. So we talked a little bit earlier about basic science, and my entire career have been a basic scientist, meaning I'm just interested in how things work. And that's really the work that I've done up till this point. But I have a colleague here at Florida State University in the College of Social Work, Tanya Wren, and she's actually an implementation scientist. And she's challenged me to get out of my comfort zone a little bit. And so we are working on a few projects where we're implementing different, what I wouldn't call stress mitigation, but I would call stress management interventions. And so some of these are really geared towards really trying to restore parasympathetic nervous system functioning. So getting people back to that homeostatic state so that they can recover, so that they can kind of take a breath and calm down, and see that stress recovery. And then others are more geared towards addressing long-term implications of prolonged stress. So folks who have PTSD, for example, and working with those folks. And so broadly, what a lot of the work has shown that can be effective in those areas, it depends on severity, it depends on the population. Mindfulness, actually, it has been shown to be highly effective. And, as a skeptic, I was very skeptical of mindfulness, and I started reading about it, and I'm like, what is this stuff? Like, I don't know about this. But as I started reading the actual literature, I realized there's strong evidence for this, and there's really no side effects. There's no downside of engaging in mindfulness. There really isn't. And so if that works for you, I think it's a great strategy. And there's lots of technology that we can use to try to engage in mindfulness in a more effective way, apps and all kinds of different things. Other than that, I think, there can be successful therapies and therapeutic interventions that aren't, pharmacological or drugs, other things that can be helpful for folks. So there definitely are different interventions out there that can be successful. But as we know, I mean, kind of what you just said, right? Like, how much of this is the person, how much is the environment? Some of that question will impact how successful an intervention is as well. Some people respond really well to an intervention because it's targeting, a physiological system that we need to target within that person, but then other people won't because there's an environmental context that we need to take into account more effectively in pairing that person with an intervention. So it can be challenging. And as I'm dipping my toe into this world more of really looking at implementing and evaluating these interventions, I'm seeing just how complicated things can actually be.
Yeah, and that's super fascinating to me. And I'm excited to, hopefully follow along with you as you uncover some of these things, because I think that therein lies the problem of just think of like the corporate example of the leader who's like, if you come to me with a problem, give me a solution. I think at times that's obviously a little silly, but it's no secret that we're dealing with a mental health crisis. I saw the other day, one in 5 Americans are dealing with mental illness. Like that's a big chunk of people. If every 5th person you see at the grocery store is unwell. And it's also no secret, I think, that everybody deals with shit, like to mention earlier, life kind of sucks sometimes. And no matter how sheltered you are, and to our point earlier, you could be so sheltered that you have a hard time dealing with stress, right? Or on the opposite end of that, you could be dealing with extreme traumatic instances and experiences. And so to me, the learning how to deal with the intervention, that seems to be where we can make the most ground with actually making progress with truly helping people with dealing with stress, dealing with adversity, things like that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of it, is also contextualizing these things like we've talked about as well, and understanding, look, this thing that you're dealing with, it's a normal thing. It's something that we as human beings are going to encounter, right? And differentiating that from the traumatic experience, from the severe, over the top, stressful experience that is unique and likely resulting in these negative outcomes. I think that's really important too, and an important part of it, because we can't just throw the kitchen sink at these things and say, okay, well, the person who is experiencing depression and anxiety but ultimately has not experienced those traumatic events, right, that they're going to get the same treatment or the same type of intervention as the person who has seen combat, for example, and is a veteran of combat, and they've actually had these other types of traumatic experiences. Not to downplay anything, but just saying those are different experiences, and they're going to need different types of intervention or treatment if they're both resulting in negative outcomes.
Dr. Joseph Schwartz, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for doing this. Is there anything else before we close off that you think is worth adding?
No, I'm just glad that folks are interested in this sort of thing, and I appreciate being able to come on and talk about it and give people a little bit of a background on some of the work that's been going on. And if they're interested in finding out more, they can check out my website, josephashwartz.com, or you can follow me on X, I guess it's called now, at Schwartz_J. I don't tweet a lot, or post a lot, but I need to get better at it. So I'm going to try my best.
Yeah, right on. And I'll include all that stuff in the description for people to check out. And, hopefully you and I will definitely stay in touch. I'm excited to see how the CrossFit Open goes for you. So we'll stay in touch with that.
For sure. I don't know how that's going to go, but I'm definitely going to do my best. That's all I can do.
That's right. It's not that bad. It's always a good time. I always leave every year feeling glad that I partook.
Yeah, and the box that I'm working out at is great. The people there are amazing, super supportive. They hold me accountable, but they're really supportive. So I'm excited to kind of go through it for the first time and see how it all shakes out.
Yeah, right on, man. Well, thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of Good People. If you enjoyed the information that Dr. Schwartz presented, make sure you check out the description and all the resources that he has to learn more. If you guys are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on our notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. If while you were listening, you enjoyed, please share this episode with someone you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time.